There is a tradition that your great-great-grandmother followed that your obstetrician has never heard of. A practice so universal, so cross-cultural, so consistently maintained across civilizations that had no contact with each other that its existence constitutes one of the most remarkable convergences in the history of human health practice, and its disappearance within a single generation during the exact period when every other traditional practice surrounding birth was being dismantled and replaced by institutional medicine, is one of the most revealing erasures I've ever investigated. Pregnant women were kept away from mirrors, not occasionally, not as a casual preference, as a rule, a medical rule. A rule maintained by midwives, by healers, by the women who attended birth and who transmitted their knowledge from mother to daughter for millennia. A rule that appeared in European folk medicine, in Chinese traditional practice, in Indian Ayurvedic texts, in African birthing traditions, in indigenous practices across the Americas. A rule so old that nobody could trace its origin and so widespread that nobody could attribute it to a single culture. The pregnant woman does not look in the mirror. The mirror is covered. The mirror is turned to the wall. The mirror is removed from the room where the pregnant woman sleeps. I found this while researching the history of prenatal care, not the modern version with its ultrasound schedules and glucose tolerance tests, the old version. The practices that midwives maintained for centuries before the physician arrived in the birthing room and declared everything that preceded him to be superstition, and buried in the midwifery texts, in the domestic manuals, in the folk practice records that ethnographers captured before the practices disappeared. I found the mirror prohibition, mentioned casually, mentioned the way you mention something so well known it barely needs explaining. Of course the mirrors are covered. Everyone knows you cover the mirrors. And then, roughly around 1880, everyone stopped knowing. This raises a simple but critical question. Why did every culture on Earth keep pregnant women away from mirrors, and why did the practice stop? The official explanation, to the extent that one exists, is superstition. The pre-modern world believed that mirrors had spiritual properties, that a mirror could capture or fragment the soul, that a pregnant woman carrying a developing soul within her was particularly vulnerable to the mirror's power. The reflection could harm the unborn child, could mark the baby, could introduce spiritual contamination at the most vulnerable stage of development. Superstition, folk belief, primitive reasoning that confused correlation with causation and that attributed magical properties to a piece of glass. And I nearly accepted this explanation, nearly filed the mirror prohibition alongside the other discarded folk practices that fill the footnotes of medical history, nearly moved on. Then I started looking at what mirrors actually do. Not spiritually, physiologically, what happens in the human body when a person looks at their own reflection. And what I found made me go back to the folk tradition with entirely different eyes. The silence was deafening. As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Start with the neuroscience. Because the neuroscience of mirror gazing is far stranger and far more significant than the modern world's casual relationship with mirrors suggests. When you look at your own reflection, your brain doesn't process it the way it processes other visual information. Self-recognition activates specific neural circuits that non-self visual processing doesn't engage. The medial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, regions associated with self-evaluation, self-criticism, and the comparison between the perceived self and the ideal self. Looking at your own reflection isn't passive observation, it's active judgment. Every time you glance in a mirror, your brain runs a rapid, largely unconscious evaluation of how you look against a template of how you think you should look. And the evaluation produces an emotional response: satisfaction or dissatisfaction, acceptance or anxiety. The mirror doesn't just show you your face, it triggers a self-assessment process that has measurable neurological and hormonal consequences. Pull up the research on mirror exposure and cortisol. Studies have documented that extended mirror gazing in populations prone to body dissatisfaction produces measurable increases in cortisol, the primary stress hormone. The mirror doesn't just make you feel bad about yourself, it triggers the physiological stress response, the same hormonal cascade that activates when you face a physical threat, when your body prepares for danger, when cortisol floods the bloodstream to mobilize energy and suppress non-essential functions, including immune function, digestive function, and reproductive function. Now apply this to pregnancy, because the pregnant body changes dramatically, rapidly, in ways that the non-pregnant self-image cannot anticipate and that the mirror reflects with unforgiving precision. The modern assumption is that a pregnant woman should monitor her changing body, should watch the transformation, should see herself changing and process the change as natural and beautiful. And for some women, in some moments, this is true. But the research on body image during pregnancy tells a different story. The deeper I went into the prenatal psychology literature, the more I found that body dissatisfaction during pregnancy is not the exception, it's the norm. Studies across multiple countries, multiple cultures, multiple decades consistently show that the majority of pregnant women experience negative body image at some point during their pregnancy. The degree varies, the timing varies, but the prevalence is remarkably consistent. Most pregnant women, most of the time, in most of the cultures studied, experience distress about their changing appearance. And the distress isn't cosmetic, it's hormonal, it's physiological. The cortisol elevation produced by negative self-evaluation doesn't just make the mother feel bad, it enters the fetal environment. The placenta converts a portion of maternal cortisol into cortisone, an inactive form, providing a buffer. But the buffer isn't complete. When maternal cortisol is chronically elevated, when the stress response is activated repeatedly over weeks and months, more cortisol crosses the placental barrier than the buffer can neutralize. Fetal cortisol exposure increases. And fetal cortisol exposure matters. Go read the research on prenatal stress and fetal development. The literature is extensive. Chronic maternal stress, measured through cortisol levels, is associated with altered fetal brain development, with changes in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis of the developing child, with increased risk of preterm birth, with lower birth weight, with altered temperament in infancy, with increased risk of anxiety and attentional difficulties in childhood. The prenatal stress literature is one of the most robust bodies of evidence in developmental psychology. Maternal cortisol affects the developing fetus. The effect is measurable. The consequences are documented across the lifespan. This raises a question that the modern medical establishment has never asked in the context it most needs to be asked. If mirror exposure triggers cortisol elevation in populations prone to body dissatisfaction, and if pregnant women are consistently documented as experiencing body dissatisfaction, and if maternal cortisol affects fetal development through documented physiological pathways, then what is the effect of daily mirror exposure during pregnancy? The silence was deafening, because the question has never been studied. Not once. No controlled trial has ever measured the effect of mirror exposure versus mirror avoidance on cortisol levels during pregnancy. No longitudinal study has ever compared birth outcomes between pregnant women who engage in regular mirror self-evaluation and pregnant women who don't. The most obvious connection in the world between a stimulus that triggers cortisol a population that is both hormonally vulnerable and prone to body dissatisfaction, and a developing organism that is measurably affected by maternal cortisol has never been investigated. And every ancient culture that practiced the mirror prohibition was, whether they understood the mechanism or not, intervening at exactly this point. Removing the stimulus, eliminating the trigger, preventing the cortisol cascade before it could start, not through medication, not through therapy, through the simplest possible environmental modification. Remove the mirror, cover the glass, turn the reflection to the wall, let the pregnant woman exist in her changing body without the daily confrontation with an image that her neurology was wired to evaluate and that her evaluation was likely to find distressing. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every culture that maintained the prohibition. Because the prohibition wasn't just about mirrors, it was part of a comprehensive environmental management strategy that traditional midwifery applied to the pregnant woman's surroundings. The midwife didn't just deliver the baby, she managed the entire prenatal environment: diet, activity, social contact, emotional exposure. The pregnant woman was protected from distressing sights, from alarming news, from conflict, from anything that might trigger the stress response that the midwife, through generations of empirical observation, understood to be harmful to the developing child. The mirror prohibition was one element of a system that recognized, without the vocabulary of cortisol and HPA axis modulation, that the pregnant woman's emotional state affected the child she was carrying. A system that intervened not at the level of chemistry, which wouldn't be understood for centuries, but at the level of environment, which could be controlled with the tools available. You couldn't measure cortisol in 1600, but you could cover a mirror, and covering the mirror accomplished what measuring cortisol would later suggest was advisable. The deeper I went into the traditional midwifery practices surrounding pregnancy, the more the mirror prohibition started to look like the tip of a much larger iceberg. Because the environmental management system that the midwife maintained wasn't just about stress reduction. It was about perception, about what the pregnant woman was allowed to see, to hear, to experience during the period when the child within her was being formed. And the theory underlying this management, the theory that what the mother perceives shapes the child she carries, was dismissed by modern medicine as maternal impression, a discredited folk belief that has been mocked in medical literature for over a century. The idea that a pregnant woman who sees something frightening might produce a child marked by fear, that a woman who looks at something beautiful might produce a beautiful child, that the mother's sensory experience during pregnancy shapes the developing organism in her womb. And then epigenetics arrived, and the mockery became very quiet, because epigenetic research has demonstrated with increasing precision that maternal environmental experience during pregnancy does affect fetal development, not through the crude mechanism of impression, where seeing a rabbit produces a child with a cleft lip, the caricature that modern medicine used to dismiss the entire concept, through the sophisticated mechanism of gene expression modification. Maternal stress, maternal nutrition, maternal sensory environment all produce epigenetic changes in the developing fetus that alter gene expression without altering the genetic code. The mother's experience writes itself onto the child's biology, not metaphorically, measurably, through methylation patterns and histone modifications that the prenatal environment produces and that the child carries into postnatal life. The folk belief wasn't right in its details. A pregnant woman who sees a cat doesn't produce a child covered in fur, but the folk belief was right in its structure. What the mother experiences during pregnancy affects the child. The environment shapes the organism. The sensory world of the pregnant woman is not irrelevant to the development of the child she carries. And the midwife who covered the mirror, who managed the pregnant woman's visual environment, who protected her from distressing sights and surrounded her with pleasing ones, was practicing environmental epigenetics with the tools of her era. Here's where the disappearance of the practice becomes specifically damning, because the mirror prohibition disappeared at the exact moment when two things happened simultaneously. The midwife was replaced by the physician, and the mirror became cheap. Before the mid-1800s, mirrors were expensive. They were luxury objects. A household might own one. The pregnant woman's exposure to her own reflection was naturally limited by the scarcity and cost of the reflective surface. The prohibition didn't need to work very hard because the stimulus was already rare. But the industrial production of mirrors in the mid to late 1800s, the same period that produced industrially milled flour and industrially produced shoes and industrially standardized everything else, made mirrors cheap, abundant, ubiquitous. For the first time in history, a pregnant woman could encounter her own reflection dozens of times a day, in the bathroom, in the hallway, in the shop window, in the compact mirror that the beauty industry was marketing to every woman as an essential accessory. And at the exact moment when mirror exposure became ubiquitous, the tradition that had limited mirror exposure during pregnancy was eliminated. The midwife who would have covered the mirror was replaced by the physician who didn't know the tradition existed. The folk practice that had protected the pregnant woman from the cortisol trigger of chronic self-evaluation was discarded as superstition at the precise historical moment when the trigger became inescapable. The deeper I went, the more the timing looked less like coincidence and more like the same pattern I've found in every investigation. The protective tradition is removed at the exact moment when the thing it protected against becomes most prevalent. The natural defense is dismantled at the exact moment when the threat intensifies, and the resulting damage is treated as a new condition rather than as the predictable consequence of removing the protection. Prenatal anxiety, prenatal depression, prenatal body image disturbance. Conditions that modern obstetric medicine treats as clinical problems requiring intervention. Conditions that generate referrals to specialists, prescriptions for medications, and revenue for the healthcare systems that manage them. Conditions that every traditional midwifery system on Earth managed through environmental modification rather than pharmacological intervention. Conditions whose prevalence maps onto the timeline of mirror ubiquity and midwifery elimination with a precision that nobody has studied because nobody has thought to connect the mirror on the wall to the cortisol in the blood to the child developing behind the placenta. I'm not telling you that mirrors cause prenatal depression. I'm telling you that mirror exposure triggers cortisol in populations prone to body dissatisfaction, that pregnant women are consistently documented as experiencing body dissatisfaction. That maternal cortisol crosses the placental barrier and affects fetal development through documented epigenetic pathways. That every traditional culture on Earth kept pregnant women away from mirrors, that the practice was universal, cross-cultural, and maintained for millennia, that it was abandoned in a single generation during the period when midwifery was replaced by institutional obstetrics, that the connection between the practice and the physiology has never been studied. I'm asking why every ancient culture on every continent arrived at the same conclusion about mirrors and pregnancy. I'm asking why the practice was abandoned without investigation. I'm asking why the most obvious controlled study in prenatal psychology, mirror exposure versus mirror avoidance during pregnancy, has never been conducted. I'm asking what the midwife knew that the obstetrician forgot.